The morning Gideon Mercer drove his truck through Maris Rowan's front gate, he wasn't there to apologize. He came to make her an offer she couldn't refuse, or so he believed. He slapped a folded check on her fence post, told her the number was more than fair, and said she ought to take it before her little science project fell apart on its own. He was smiling when he said it. That smile, easy, patient, the kind worn by men who've never once been told no and meant it, was the same smile he'd worn the day she bought 70 dying calves for $6 at a Missouri stockyard while he stood in the crowd and laughed loud enough for 2 counties to hear. She didn't pick up the check. She looked at him for a long moment, then went back to work. That was the moment everything changed, though neither of them knew it yet. If this story moves something in you, that quiet fury, that stubborn hope, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The stockyard smelled the way stockyards always smell. Manure baked into wood, the sour edge of animals packed too close, diesel from the auction trucks idling outside. Maris Rowan stood near the far pen and tried to breathe through her mouth without making it obvious. She was 19 years old, wearing her great-aunt Della's old canvas jacket because her own had a broken zipper and the November air had teeth that morning. She had $6 in her wallet. She had driven 90 minutes in a truck that needed a new alternator. She had no business being at an auction. She knew that. She was there anyway. The pen she was looking at held 70 calves that nobody wanted. They were thin, not starvation thin, but the wrong kind of thin, the kind that comes from weeks of low-grade misery. Several of them had their heads dropped low, noses running clear and yellow by turns. A few were coughing, not the occasional throat-clearing kind of cough, but the deep, rattling pulls from the chest kind that made people nearby step back instinctively. A man in a green jacket leaned on the fence beside her and shook his head without her asking. "Graveyard cattle," he said. "Respiratory. Half of them are already dead. They just don't know it yet." He said it pleasantly, the way someone might describe the weather. Then he walked away. Maris didn't walk away. She watched the calves for a long time, not with the calculating eye of a buyer doing math in her head. She didn't have money to do math with, but with the particular quality of attention she had developed over 2 years of working weekends and summers for Dr. Annette Voss, a large animal veterinarian out of Clarkfield who had a reputation for taking on cases other vets had already billed and abandoned. Maris had watched Dr. Voss work. She had held frightened animals while needles went in. She had cleaned wounds and logged symptoms and handed instruments across the flanks of horses and cattle in conditions that ranged from miserably cold to intolerably hot. She had learned things that weren't in any textbook because Dr. Voss believed that books told you what to look for and experience taught you what you were actually seeing. What Maris was seeing now, looking at these 70 calves, was not a graveyard. She saw an upper respiratory outbreak. Serious, yes. She saw animals that had been stressed, probably during a long transport, probably without adequate water, almost certainly commingled with other cattle from different origins so that whatever pathogen was circulating had moved through the group unchecked. She saw calves that were sick, but not all of them equally. She saw 6 or 7 in the back corner that were holding their heads up. She saw 2 calves near the gate that had good eye clarity despite the runny noses. She saw a problem that had a solution, if the solution was applied correctly and the person applying it didn't panic. What she did not see was a single way she could afford to buy 70 calves. The auction started at noon. Maris found a spot on the rail and watched the earlier lots go through. Healthy yearlings, good pairs, 3 bulls that caused a ripple of serious bidding and left her feeling like a child at an adult's table. She watched the auctioneer work, the rhythm of it, the way bids came in with a flick of a finger or a nod so slight you'd miss it if you blinked. Then the graveyard cattle came up. The auctioneer didn't say much. He described them as a mixed lot, backgrounded calves, and noted the respiratory issue with the particular neutrality of a man who had said uncomfortable things so many times they'd lost their discomfort. The pen was visible from the ring. Everyone could hear the coughing from where they stood. Bidding opened at $50 a head. Nobody moved. The auctioneer tried 40. Still nothing. 20. One man bid 20, clearly testing something, and then withdrew with a small head shake when the auctioneer looked his way again. 10. Maris's heart was doing something unusual in her chest. Not racing, exactly, but insistent, like a knock on a door you already know you're going to answer. She raised her hand. The auction room went quiet in a way she hadn't expected. Not the quiet of suspense, but the quiet of collective confusion, like a group of people turning simultaneously to see what strange thing had just made a sound. "Young lady." The auctioneer found her at the rail. He didn't look unkind exactly, but he had the expression of a man who wanted to be sure. "You are aware of the condition of this lot?" "Yes, sir," Maris said. "These are sold as is," he said. "No warranty, no returns. If half of them don't make it through the week." "I understand." From somewhere behind her, loud enough to be intended, "She's buying herself a funeral." Laughter. Not mean laughter, or not only mean. It was the loose, social laughter of a crowd that had identified something absurd and was relieved to be on the outside of it. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer. $10 a head," he said, though she could see in his face that he doubted she'd hold. Silence. Another beat of it. "Per head," someone repeated, and the laughter came again, shaped differently this time, edged with something sharper. The voice came from her left, where the real buyers stood, the ranchers with established operations, the men who bought in volume and knew their numbers cold. She had seen him earlier without knowing who he was. He was tall, maybe 60, with the particular physical ease of a man who has never spent a single day of his adult life wondering if there would be enough. He was wearing a good coat. His boots were clean despite the stockyard mud, which told her something about the kind of man he arranged his world to be. His name, she would learn later, was Gideon Mercer. He ran 3,000 acres of pasture 12 miles east of Clarkfield and had a reputation as the most successful cattleman in 4 counties, which gave his opinion the weight of gospel in rooms like this one. "Somebody should stop her," Gideon said, not quietly, "before she wastes her allowance." More laughter. Maris looked at the auctioneer. "Sold," she said. The auctioneer looked at Gideon. Gideon shrugged with theatrical amusement, the gesture of a man so certain of an outcome he found the delay entertaining. The auctioneer looked back at Maris. He had the practiced blankness of someone who had seen enough strange things at auction that he had learned to process them without expression. "Sold," he said. 70 head, to the young lady in the canvas jacket. The total came to $6.30, rounded down at the window by a clerk who had clearly done the math wrong, and then looked at the lot number again and shrugged because rounding down 10 cents on a $6 transaction felt like the right call. She paid it in exact change. She had planned to pay with a card, but the machine was down, and she had exactly $6.40 in cash, which meant she walked out of that auction with 10 cents and 70 dying calves and a 90-minute drive back to a farm that hadn't been properly worked in 11 years. The loading took 2 hours. Several calves had to be encouraged into the trailer with more patience than force. Maris had learned from Dr. Voss that frightened cattle pushed too hard will hurt themselves and others, so she moved slowly, spoke low, let the animals set the pace even when the clock was burning against her. A few of the stockyard workers helped without being asked, and one of them, a young guy, maybe her age, named Phil, looked at her sideways as he latched the trailer gate. "You know what you're doing?" he asked. "No," she said honestly, "but I know what I saw." Phil looked at the trailer, looked at her. "Good luck," he said in the tone of a person who means it, despite not believing it will help. She drove home through flat Missouri farmland that turned hilly in the last 20 miles, the land rising and folding in on itself the way land does when it's been shaped by something older than farming. The Rowan property sat on a hillside that her great-grandfather Silas had bought in 1931 under circumstances the family never fully explained, and which had passed through 2 generations before arriving, by a series of deaths and disclaimers, to Maris's great-aunt Della, who had held it without really working it and had let Maris move in 3 months earlier after it became clear that Maris's living situation in Clarkfield, a spare room above a tire shop, was not going to be tenable long-term. The farm had a barn. It had fencing of variable integrity. It had a well that worked, and a farmhouse that needed new windows on the north side, and a water heater that had been on borrowed time since the previous administration. It had 60 acres of what most people would describe as overgrown nothing: tall grass, invasive brush along the creek, timber on the upper slopes that had never been cleared. It also had, stacked in the back bedroom under a tarp that smelled of cedar and mouse droppings, 11 field journals belonging to Silas Rowan, written in pencil across 6 decades of farming in handwriting that grew smaller and more deliberate as the years advanced. Maris had not read them yet. She had no time for reading. She had 70 sick calves to keep alive through a Missouri winter. The first night was the worst, not because anything catastrophic happened. It was the uncertainty that made it hard, the not knowing how quickly things could go wrong or which animal would turn the corner in the wrong direction first. She had no veterinary supplies beyond what she'd scrounged from Dr. Voss's discard bin. Expired but not dangerously expired electrolytes, some basic wound care materials, 2 bottles of antibiotic that she was not licensed to administer and would need advice before using. She called Dr. Voss at 9:30 that night from the barn floor, phone wedged between her ear and shoulder, while she ran her hands along the spine of a calf that had gone down in the corner. Dr. Voss was in the middle of something. She could hear it in the background, but she didn't tell Maris to call back. "How many down?" she asked. 3 lying, Maris said. "This one's the worst. Temp is—" She looked at the thermometer she'd borrowed from Della's bathroom cabinet. 104.2. A pause. "Can she stand if you encourage her?" Maris put her hand under the calf's sternum and lifted gently. The animal's legs moved, found purchase, wobbled, but held. "Yes," Maris said. "Good sign. That's a good sign." Dr. Voss's voice shifted slightly. She'd moved somewhere quieter. "Listen to me. What you need to do tonight is water, every single one of them, individually, if you have to. You need to separate the worst cases from the rest, get them away from the general stress of the group. Don't push them. Don't force feed. Keep them warm and let them drink." "Okay," Maris said. "And Maris." "Yeah." "Don't spend tonight trying to save them all. Spend it learning which ones you can save." It was the coldest thing anyone had said to her all day, and it was also the most useful. She held on to it as she worked through the next 6 hours, carrying water in buckets from the hydrant to the makeshift infirmary she'd partitioned off inside the barn using cattle panels she'd found leaning against the back fence. She moved the 12 worst cases in first, then the second-tier sick, then the calves that looked relatively stable into the main barn space where they could eat hay and breathe without the added stress of watching their sicker pen mates. She didn't sleep. Not really. She dozed twice in the straw, 20 minutes each time, and woke with her face cold and her back aching and her mind immediately returning to the calf in the corner with the temperature. The calf's name, Maris gave all of them names eventually, even though she knew better, even though every practical instinct said not to get attached when you didn't know who would make it, was Cora. Not for any particular reason. She had just looked at the small, miserable face in the dim light and thought Cora, and that was that. Cora was still standing when the sun came up. Over the next 3 weeks, Maris established a routine so demanding that Della, watching from the farmhouse window, began leaving coffee on the barn gate post before dawn because there was no point calling Maris in for breakfast when Maris would not come. The routine was built around one principle Dr. Voss had drilled into her. Sick cattle need 4 things above everything else. They need water, warmth, rest, and the absence of additional stress. They do not need heroism. They do not need complicated intervention. They need the basics, delivered consistently, without panic. Maris delivered the basics. She carried water by hand when the barn hydrant froze, and she hadn't yet figured out the heat tape situation. She broke ice from the water troughs at 5 in the morning. She moved calves that were getting pushed around by penmates who were feeling better and starting to assert themselves. She kept records. Not fancy records, just a spiral notebook with each calf's initial, a rough temperature chart, a notation of what they ate and whether they drank and how they stood. She lost 11 of them. Not all at once. It happened across 2 weeks, 1 or 2 at a time, and each time it happened she stood in the pen for a minute and then she wrote down the initial and put a line through it, and she did not let herself think about the line until later. Later, alone in the farmhouse, she would think about it, but not during the day. During the day, she could not afford the weight of it. The 59th calf survived. The last one to clear the worst of the infection was a roan-sided steer she'd named Bucket because he had knocked over 3 of them in his first week. By mid-December, he was eating well and building muscle and butting his head against the fence rail with the particular energy of a young animal that has recently rediscovered the pleasure of feeling good. Della came out to the barn the day Maris finally let herself acknowledge it. The turning point, the moment she knew the herd was going to survive. The old woman stood in the barn doorway in her coat and her rubber boots and looked at 59 calves in various states of active, energetic, chaotic recovery, and she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Your great-grandfather would have done the same thing." Maris looked at her. Della almost never talked about Silas. She talked around him sometimes, the way people talk around a piece of furniture that's too large to move and too significant to ignore. "What do you mean?" Maris asked. Della looked at the herd, then she looked at her niece. "He bought animals nobody wanted to," she said. "He had his reasons." She paused. "There are some journals in the back bedroom. You should probably read them." Maris had seen the journals. She hadn't touched them. That night she went and got them. She started with the oldest one, dated 1934, written in pencil on paper so thin she had to handle the pages with 2 fingers. The handwriting was careful and angular. A man who'd been taught to write properly, who took the task seriously. The early entries were farming records, the kind of things she expected: rainfall totals, planting dates, livestock counts, expenses. But between the records were observations, and it was the observations that stopped her. The south pasture holds grass through late August that the creek bottom doesn't. I believe it has to do with how the land holds rain. The cattle prefer it and do better when they spend the last weeks of summer there. Noted again, calves born in March outperform September calves on this ground, not elsewhere. This specific ground. The native grass on the upper ridge is not what I was told. The extension agent said to plow it under and reseed. I didn't. I'm beginning to think he was wrong about what's up there. She read until 1 in the morning, then she made herself stop because she had to be back in the barn at 5. But she put the journals on the kitchen table, stacked carefully, and she looked at them as she made her coffee in the dark, and something was settling in her. Something she had no name for yet. A direction. A sense of a path made by someone else who had been looking at the same ground. By the time December turned to January and the herd was eating and moving and beginning to look like the animals they were supposed to be, word had gotten around the county the way word always gets around, imprecise and irresistible, carried by people who had been at the auction, people who drove past and saw the truck at the farm, people who talked to other people. Most of the talk was disbelief. Some of it was grudging acknowledgement, and some of it, the kind she heard through Della, through Phil at the stockyard, through the woman at the feed store who watched people too carefully and talked to too many of them, was Gideon Mercer's voice, still certain, still patient. She got lucky, Gideon was saying. Any rancher will tell you, sometimes sick cattle surprise you and pull through. That doesn't mean anything. Wait till spring. That land can't support a herd. It never could. He wasn't entirely wrong about the land. It was a problem she hadn't solved yet. The 60 acres were capable of feeding 59 calves through winter with supplemental hay, but hay wasn't free, and the hay she was burning through was the hay she'd found stacked in the barn and the hay she'd bought on credit from a neighbor who liked Della and was willing to wait. Come spring, come summer, the calves would need more. More ground, or better ground, or a ground that could do more than it appeared to be doing. She had a hunch about that. She had 11 journals that suggested she might not be wrong. She just needed the ground to thaw enough to show her. The ground thawed in the second week of February, which was earlier than usual and not entirely welcome. Early thaws in that part of Missouri meant mud. The deep, sucking, boot-stealing kind that made every chore take twice as long and left you exhausted before noon. Maris didn't mind the mud the way she minded the cold. Cold was harder to work in. Mud was just inconvenient and humiliating, and she had made a kind of peace with being humiliated by the land because the land didn't mean it personally. She was out on the upper ridge the morning the frost broke, walking the ground Silas had written about in his third journal, the one dated 1941, the year he'd apparently spent more time observing the land than farming it, which had caused some friction with his neighbors, who believed that a man walking his property with a notebook was a man not doing his job. She had the journal in her coat pocket. She had pulled the relevant pages the night before, folded them carefully, and she kept taking them out and reading sections, and then looking at the ground and trying to match what Silas had described to what she was seeing. What she was seeing was grass. Not dramatic grass. Not the kind of grass that made you stop and catch your breath. Just grass. Brown still from winter, flattened by months of cold and snow, unremarkable in every visual sense. But when she crouched down and pulled the dead growth aside with her fingers, the base of the stems was alive. Not just alive, it was dense, rooted deep, the kind of root structure that went down 3-4 feet into soil that didn't give it up easily. She recognized it. Dr. Voss had taken her to a property in the eastern part of the county 2 years earlier, a remnant prairie tract that a retired biology professor had been protecting for decades, and had pointed to the grass and named it and explained what it did, how it held water, how it fixed nitrogen, how cattle that grazed it put on weight differently than cattle on improved pasture, something about the mineral profile of the soil, something about the way the grass stored nutrients that cultivated grasses didn't bother with. Silas had known this. He'd written it in 1941, without the vocabulary for it, but the knowledge was there. The cattle do better on the upper ridge. I don't know why. I know that I'm right. She stood up and looked out over 60 acres and felt the particular vertigo of a person who has just understood something that changes the scale of the problem they are holding. It wasn't a small thing she'd bought for $6. It was something else entirely. She just didn't know yet whether she was equipped to prove it. The first person she told was Della. Not because Della would understand the agricultural significance of it. Della's relationship with the land was that it was there and it belonged to the family, and one didn't sell it, a position she held with the firmness of a woman who had made one irreversible decision and was committed to it. But Della was the person Maris trusted, and trust had become a limited resource that she rationed carefully since the auction. She came in from the ridge at noon with mud up to her knees and the journals under her arm, and she put them on the kitchen table and spread the relevant pages out and tried to explain what she'd found. Della listened. She made them both sandwiches while she listened, which was her way of managing conversations that required attention. She needed her hands busy or her mind wandered. When Maris finished, Della put a sandwich in front of her and sat down and looked at the journal pages for a moment. Silas used to say the extension agents didn't know what they didn't know, Della said. He said it politely, but he meant it. He was right, Maris said. About the grass, at least. What's up on that ridge is native. It's been there a long time, and it's not dead, and I think if I manage it right— She stopped, because she was getting ahead of herself, and she knew it. I need to rotate the herd, small sections. Let each section recover before they go back on it. It'll take time. How much time? Before it's fully established? A year? Maybe 2? She paused. Before I can see whether it's working, probably by fall. Della chewed her sandwich. And until then? Until then I need hay, and I need to not lose any more calves. She looked at the journal. And I need someone to tell me I'm not reading this wrong. Della looked at her steadily. Are you? No, Maris said. I don't think so. Then you're not reading it wrong. It wasn't scientific validation. It wasn't the kind of confirmation that would hold up in an argument with Gideon Mercer or the county extension office or any of the people who had already decided what the Rowan property was capable of. But it was Della looking at her across a kitchen table and saying, "You know what you see." And that morning it was enough to get her back outside. The problem with the hay became acute in March. She had burned through the barn stock faster than she'd planned, partly because the winter ran long and cold in ways that February's early thaw had falsely promised wouldn't happen, and partly because a herd of 59 recovering animals ate more than a herd of 59 settled ones. They were healthy now, genuinely healthy, and health requires fuel. She watched them eat and felt the simultaneous satisfaction of their recovery and the arithmetic of it bearing down on her. She called Phil at the stockyard, not because Phil could solve her problem, but because he was the only person besides Dr. Voss who had watched her buy those calves without making her feel like a cautionary tale. "I need hay," she said. "I'm looking at 3, maybe 4 more weeks of full supplement before I can start transitioning them to pasture." "How much?" Phil asked. She told him. He whistled low through his teeth. "That's a lot." "I know that's a lot. There's a guy up past Hartwell who has square bales. Old operation. Been sitting on inventory since fall." "What's he want for it?" Phil told her. It was more than she had. Not dramatically more. It wasn't the gap between poverty and comfort. It was the smaller and more grinding gap between having a plan and having the means to execute it. She thanked him and hung up and sat in the truck cab in the farmyard for a while, doing arithmetic on the back of a receipt she found in the glove box. She had sold some of the calf lot, 4 of the smallest steers she'd assessed as unlikely to do well on pasture, to a neighbor in January, and that money was what she'd been running on. She had a small amount left. Not enough. Dr. Voss was the next call. "I'm not asking for a loan," Maris said before Dr. Voss could say anything. "I need work. Whatever you have. I can do weekends, evenings. I can rearrange." "I have a weekend," Dr. Voss said. 3 farms, Saturday, starts early. I'll pay you at the end of the day." "That's not going to be enough for the hay." A silence. Then, "I'll front you the rest. You can pay me back when you sell the calves in fall." Maris closed her eyes. She didn't want to owe anyone anything. She had a specific, almost physical aversion to debt that she couldn't entirely explain and didn't fully examine, except that it had something to do with the way her father had died. Not from debt exactly, but from the particular exhaustion that comes from owing more than you can see your way clear of. She hadn't witnessed it directly. She'd been 11, but she'd absorbed it the way children absorb the things adults think they're hiding. "I'll pay you back before fall," she said. "I know you will," Dr. Voss said, with a certainty that was either founded in genuine faith or professional courtesy, and Maris chose not to examine which. The hay came in the 2nd week of March. The man past Hartwell turned out to be 72 years old and deeply skeptical of Maris on sight, the way some men of that age were skeptical of women doing things they categorized as men's work. Not viciously, just reflexively, the skepticism of habit rather than conviction. He watched her stack bales in the truck bed with his arms crossed and his expression professionally neutral. "You the one who bought the coughing calves?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," she said, without breaking her stacking rhythm. "Heard about that." He watched her for another moment. "Heard they pulled through." "Most of them." He was quiet. Then, "My granddaughter wants to be a vet." He said it sideways, like it wasn't directly related to anything, which meant it was directly related to everything. "She should," Maris said. "It's good work." He helped her with the last 6 bales. The rotation she started in April was based directly on Silas's journals, and partly on a system she pieced together from a book Dr. Voss had lent her. A dense, practical text on managed grazing, written by a rancher in the 80s who had figured out most of it by making expensive mistakes and recording them carefully. The principle was simple enough to state: you move the herd onto a section, you let them graze it down to a specific height, you move them off before they damage the root system, and you don't bring them back until the grass has fully recovered. The timing varies by season, by rainfall, by soil condition, by the specific mix of grasses present. The execution was not simple. It required fencing, temporary fencing that she could move as the rotation demanded, and it required her to be watching constantly to understand what grazed down to the right height looked like versus grazed down too far, which she was learning by watching and making mistakes and correcting them. It required her to trust the grass in a way that felt counterintuitive at first, to look at a section she'd pulled the cattle off and resist the urge to put them back when it still looked sparse, to wait until the recovery was genuine rather than cosmetic. Silas had written about this in his particular way. The temptation is to use all the land all the time. I've learned this is how you end up with no land worth using. She fenced the ridge into 5 sections using posts she pulled from a pile behind the barn and wire she bought in town, and she moved the herd for the first time on a Tuesday morning in late April When the grass on the first section had reached a height she'd decided, based on the book and the journals and her own observation, was correct. The calves walked onto the section and dropped their heads and ate, and the sound of 59 animals grazing, that steady, tearing, rhythmic sound, was one of the better sounds she'd heard in a long time. She stood at the fence and watched them, and felt, briefly, like everything might be all right. 3 days later, Gideon Mercer drove past on the county road. She heard his truck slow and knew without looking who it was. She had learned the sound of his engine the way you learn the sound of weather, not consciously, but as a matter of self-preservation. She kept her eyes on the herd. His window came down. "What's the fencing for?" "Rotation," she said. A pause. "Rotation on 60 acres. Neh." He said it the way someone might say swimming to Europe. Not angry, amused, which was somehow worse. "You know what a rotation system requires in terms of carrying capacity?" "Yes." "You don't have the ground for it. You need—" "I know what I need," she said, still not looking at him. "Thank you." Another pause, longer this time. She could feel him deciding something, whether to push further, whether she was worth the effort of further argument. Whatever he decided, it resulted in his window going up and his truck moving on down the road. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The calves kept eating. What she had not told Gideon, because she owed him nothing and also because she hadn't entirely proven it yet, was that the 60 acres were performing in a way she hadn't fully expected, even given what Silas's journals had suggested. The root system on the ridge sections was deeper and more established than she'd seen on improved pasture, and the recovery rate between grazing rotations was faster than the book had told her to anticipate. By the third rotation in June, the first section she'd grazed in April was lush in a way that surprised her. Not dramatically lush, not the green of irrigated commercial pasture, but dense and resilient, the kind of growth that comes from a soil that knows what it's doing. She pulled grass samples and drove them to the county extension office in Clarkfield and asked them to test the soil. The agent who took her sample was polite and unhelpful in the way extension agents sometimes are when they've already categorized you. Too young, no formal agriculture background, came from nowhere with a herd nobody wanted. He told her results would take 2 to 3 weeks. She said that was fine. 3 weeks later, she drove back and picked up the results and sat in the parking lot and read the numbers. The nutrient profile was not what degraded pasture soil looked like. It was not exceptional. She needed to manage it well, needed to keep doing what she was doing, needed to resist the temptation to push it harder than it could handle. But it was genuinely good soil. It had been good soil all along. It had just never been managed in a way that let it show what it was. She thought about Silas driving out to the same county office, or one like it, and being told to plow the ridge under and reseed with something more conventional. She thought about what it costs to trust yourself against the consensus of people who carry credentials and speak with authority. She thought about him writing in his journal anyway, year after year, the observations accumulating into a kind of private proof that nobody had ever asked him to produce. She understood him better than she'd understood anyone in a long time. Summer was hard in a different way than winter. Winter had been physically brutal. The cold, the hauling, the vigilance required to keep sick animals warm and watered through temperatures that turned everything into a problem. Summer was hot and relentless and required a different kind of attention, the kind that lives in the peripheral vision, the constant watching for animals that are off their feed or standing separately from the herd or moving wrong. She lost one more calf in June to a cause she couldn't fully establish. It had been the smallest of the 59, chronically behind on weight gain, and she had known since April that it was the one she was watching most carefully. When she found it one morning, she was not surprised, and she was also not okay about it, and she sat in the barn for 20 minutes before she could make herself deal with it practically. 58. She wrote it in the notebook, put a line through it. Dr. Voss came out in July to do health checks on the herd, partly as professional assessment and partly because she'd asked to see what Maris was doing with the pasture. She walked the ridge sections with Maris in the late afternoon heat, stopping occasionally to crouch down and look at the grass or pull a handful up and examine the root. She didn't say much while she was doing it. Dr. Voss was a woman who processed things internally and delivered conclusions after the fact, and Maris had learned not to push her for running commentary. When they came back down to the barn, Dr. Voss leaned against the fence and looked at the herd grazing the fourth section and was quiet for a moment. "You know what you've got here," she said finally. "I'm starting to," Maris said. "It's not just the calves." She looked at the ridge. "It's the land. Somebody managed this right a long time ago, and then it just sat. It's been recovering on its own for however many years, and She paused. "You're finishing what it started." Maris told her about Silas's journals. She hadn't planned to. It felt like something private, like showing someone a letter that wasn't addressed to them. But she found herself describing what she'd found in them and what she'd been doing to test the observations against current conditions. And Dr. Voss listened in the way she always listened, which was fully without performing the listening. "Has anyone else seen those journals?" Dr. Voss asked. "Della knew about them. She's the one who told me to read them." "Anyone in the agricultural community? Extension office?" "No," Maris said. Dr. Voss looked at her. "You should keep it that way for now," she said. "Not forever, but until you have a full season's data." Maris understood what she meant. An idea without evidence is just an idea, and in a county where her credibility had started at 0 and built to somewhere barely above it, she needed to show what she had before she could afford to describe what she believed. August came with the particular heat of late summer that doesn't break until midnight and starts again before 5. The calves were not calves anymore. They were young cattle, and they were putting on weight in a way that she tracked obsessively in the notebook. Not just the numbers themselves, but the distribution of the weight gain across the herd, which animals were tracking ahead of expectation and which were behind, and why. She found herself cross-referencing the weight records against the pasture rotation records, trying to understand whether there was a correlation between which section an animal had most recently grazed and how their weight progression was sitting. And she thought there was something there, but the data set was too small and too tangled with other variables to be certain. She needed another season to be certain. She needed another season to be certain about a lot of things. What she didn't need another season for was what happened in the third week of August, which arrived without warning and hit harder than anything else the year had handed her. She was in the barn doing the afternoon check when her phone rang. It was Della's neighbor, a woman named Kay, who lived half a mile down the road and had an arrangement with Della where they called each other in the mornings, and if one of them didn't answer, the other came by. "Maris," Kay said, and the way she said it was enough. She got to the house in under 2 minutes. Della was in the kitchen, seated at the table, one hand resting on the surface as though she'd placed it there deliberately to hold herself upright. She was conscious. She was oriented. She was also gray in a way that made Maris's stomach drop immediately. "I'm fine," Della said before Maris could speak. "You're not," Maris said. "I had a spell." The word spell was Della's architecture for any physical event she found embarrassing. Dizziness, a faint, any moment in which her body did something outside her authority over it. "How long have you been sitting here?" "Not long," Della said, which Kay's expression behind her clearly contradicted. The ambulance took 40 minutes, which was standard for out here, and Maris rode with Della and held the old woman's hand in the back of it and listened to Della complain about the way the paramedic had asked her questions as though she were hard of hearing. The doctor at the hospital in Clarkfield said it was her heart, not a heart attack technically, but the preliminary conversation before one, the kind of event that serves as notice. He said she needed rest, reduced exertion, adjusted medication, and follow-up care that would involve coming in weekly for the next month. Della looked at Maris across the hospital room with an expression that contained several things at once. Awareness that this was serious, annoyance at being observed, being aware that it was serious, and something underneath both of those things that was harder to read. "The cattle," Della said. "They're fine," Maris said. "I checked before the ambulance came." "That's not what I meant." Della looked at the window. "The cattle, the land, all of it. Don't stop because of me." Maris looked at her. "I won't." "I mean it," Della said. "I have been in this family long enough to watch people stop." She turned back from the window. "Silas didn't stop and he was right. Don't you stop." She said it quietly, not dramatically. Della was not a dramatic woman. She was the kind of woman who delivers the most important things she has to say in the same tone she uses to note that it might rain later, and it was this quality that had always made Maris take her seriously. "I won't stop," Maris said. Della patted her hand once, the way she did, and that was the end of the conversation. The weeks that followed were the most demanding of the year, which was a high bar given everything that had preceded them. She was managing the herd through the final summer rotation, preparing her records for the fall selling decision, running Della to Clarkfield twice a week for medical appointments, keeping up with the maintenance on the fencing that the summer heat and the cattle leaning on it had degraded in 3 places, and trying to function on 6 hours of sleep on a good night. She dropped a fence post on her foot in early September and broke 2 toes, which she discovered not by going to the doctor, but by the particular nature of the pain and the swelling and the fact that she'd seen a calf with a similar injury and recognized the profile of it. She taped them and kept working. She was not proud of this. It was just what was in front of her. What was also in front of her, by the end of September, was a decision she'd been building toward all year. The cattle were ready to sell. She could see it in their weight, in their condition, in the assessment she'd asked Dr. Voss to give her at the fall health check. 58 cattle, well-finished, in good health, coming off native prairie grass in a way that a cattle buyer would recognize as unusual if they knew what they were looking at. The question was whether to sell them. Not whether to sell all of them. Some of them she would have to sell. She needed the income. But she'd been turning over in her mind for weeks a different option, something that felt either very smart or very stupid, and she couldn't determine which. She'd been reading about direct-to-consumer beef sales. She'd been thinking about a conversation she'd had in July with a woman named Rosalie Baird, who ran the counter at the diner in Millhaven and had, in the course of a conversation about nothing in particular, mentioned that her boss had been looking for a local beef supplier for 2 years and couldn't find one whose product was consistent enough. Consistent enough how? Maris had asked. Flavor, Rosalie had said. Quality. She says what she can get through the wholesale distributor tastes like nothing. She wants something that actually tastes like something. Maris had not said anything in response to this, but she had thought about it, with the portion of her brain that was always running calculations in the background while the rest of her was doing other things. She thought about it now. She thought about Silas writing, "I don't know why. I know that I'm right." She thought about Dr. Voss saying, "You know what you've got here." She thought about 58 cattle that had come from nothing, from a stockyard pen, from $70 votes of no confidence, from $6.30 and an alternator that needed replacing, and had grown into something on this ground, on Silas's grass, on water she'd carried by hand through snow. She thought about selling them wholesale and getting a fair price, which was the sensible thing, the thing everyone would tell her to do. Then she thought about what Gideon Mercer's face would look like if she did something other than the sensible thing. And it turned out that thought was not nothing, and she was not too principled to admit it. She drove to Millhaven the next morning and asked to speak with the owner of the diner. The owner of the diner in Millhaven was a woman named Cecile Harp, who was 54 years old and had run the place for 19 of those years, and had the particular quality of stillness that comes from having navigated enough difficult situations that new ones don't rattle you the way they once did. She was at the counter when Maris walked in, going through a stack of invoices with a pen tucked behind her ear, and she looked up with the expression of a woman who had learned to read people quickly because her business required it. "You're the Rowan girl," Cecile said. Not unkindly, just the county's way of establishing coordinates. "Maris Rowan," she said. "Yes, ma'am?" Cecile set down her pen. "Rosalie told me you might come by." She looked at Maris for a moment with an assessment that was direct without being aggressive. "Sit down." Maris sat. Cecile poured 2 coffees without asking whether she wanted one, which Maris appreciated because she did want one and would have felt awkward requesting it under the circumstances. "Tell me about your cattle," Cecile said. So Maris told her. Not the whole story, because she didn't start with the auction, didn't explain the $6, didn't reach for the parts that were dramatic because she wasn't there to perform. She told Cecile what the animals had been eating, how the pasture was managed, what the soil profile looked like, what Dr. Voss had said about the condition of the herd at the fall health check. She talked about grass finishing the way Dr. Voss had taught her to talk about animal nutrition, specifically without enthusiasm that outpaced evidence. Cecile listened the same way she'd looked at Maris when she walked in. Fully, without pretending to be more convinced than she was. I've had 2 other ranchers in here in the last 3 years telling me their beef was special, Cecile said when Maris finished. One of them was right that it was better than average. Neither of them could supply me consistently. I'm not promising consistent supply yet, Maris said. I have 58 head ready this fall. That's what I have. I'm not going to tell you I can do more than I can. Something shifted in Cecile's expression. Barely perceptible, but there. How much per pound? Maris had a number. She'd worked it out the night before at the kitchen table, factoring in processing costs, her debt to Dr. Voss, the hay she still owed on, a margin that was honest rather than ambitious. She said the number. Cecile's eyes didn't move. That's higher than wholesale. Yes. By about 30%. Yes. Cecile picked up her coffee, set it down without drinking it. I need to taste it first, she said. I know, Maris said. That's why I'm here. The processing arrangement required a licensed facility, and the nearest one that would work with small direct-to-consumer operations was 40 minutes away in a town called Heber. Maris had already called them. She had already gotten the paperwork. What she needed was to sell enough head wholesale to cover the processing costs for the portion she was diverting to Cecile, and to do that without cutting into the margin so deeply that the direct sale stopped making financial sense. She sat in the truck outside the diner and did the arithmetic 3 times on a legal pad she kept in the passenger seat. The numbers worked. Not comfortably so. There was no cushion in them, no room for a problem she hadn't anticipated. But they worked. She called Phil. I need a buyer for 40 head, she said. Good condition, grass finished. I need a fair price, not a great one. I need it to move fast. Phil was quiet for a second. You holding back the other 18? Yeah. For what? She told him. Another silence, slightly different in texture. Less surprise, more consideration. You're going to need a buyer who doesn't talk, Phil said finally. Because if Mercer hears you're trying to go direct to consumer before you've actually done it, he'll say I'm going to fail, Maris said. He's going to say that regardless. He might do more than say it, Phil said. He's got relationships with the processing facilities. Nothing formal, but Phil. Yeah. Find me the buyer. He found her the buyer. A livestock operation 2 counties over that was looking to purchase backgrounded cattle for finishing and didn't have Gideon Mercer's phone number in their contacts. The sale took place on a Thursday in the first week of October, 40 head loaded and gone by 9 in the morning, and Maris stood in the empty section of the pasture afterward and watched the remaining 18 cattle move around in the space the others had vacated and felt the particular feeling of having committed to a path that no longer had a retreat on it. 18 head were going to Cecile Harp's diner, or they weren't, and this whole thing was going to collapse in a way that would confirm every single thing Gideon Mercer had been saying for a year. She did not tell Della the specifics. She told her that the fall sale had gone well, that the bills were covered, that things were in order. Della had been better since August. The medication adjustment had steadied her, and the twice-weekly appointments in Clarkfield had tapered to monthly. She was moving carefully, which she resented, and she was eating the food Maris put in front of her with less argument than before, which suggested she was taking her situation more seriously than she let on. What Della knew about the diner arrangement was that it was happening. She didn't ask for the breakdown. She looked at Maris across the kitchen one evening and said, "Are you going to be all right if it doesn't work?" And Maris said yes, which was partially true in the way that most answers to that question are partially true. The processing happened on a Tuesday. Maris drove to Heber, handled the paperwork, oversaw what she could, and drove back with the first delivery ready for Cecile by Thursday. She pulled into the diner's back lot at 7 in the morning and unloaded the coolers herself and stood in Cecile's kitchen while the woman looked at the cuts. Cecile handled the meat with professional attention, the way a cook handles ingredients that require respect rather than performance. She didn't say much. She put a portion in a pan, no seasoning, nothing that would alter or enhance what she was evaluating, and she cooked it to medium and cut a piece and tasted it. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Okay," Cecile said. Maris waited. "This is different," Cecile said. She cut another piece and ate it, and her expression was the expression of a person running an internal calculation that was coming out better than expected. "The fat distribution." "From the native grass," Maris said. "It's different from improved pasture. The fatty acid profile is..." She stopped. Sorry, I'm getting technical. No, go ahead, Cecile said. I want to understand it. So Maris explained it. The way the native grasses produce different nutrient compounds than cultivated forage, the way that changed what the cattle stored in their tissue, the way that affected flavor at the table in ways that were subtle but consistent. She was careful not to overstate it. She didn't have laboratory analysis. She had Dr. Voss's knowledge and Silas's observations and her own records. It was more than nothing. It wasn't peer-reviewed science. Cecile listened, tasted again. I'm going to put it on the menu with a description, she said. Not a marketing description, a real one. Where it came from, how it was raised. Okay, Maris said. If my customers respond the way I think they will, I'm going to want to talk about next year. Maris drove home on the county road with the windows down because the October morning was still warm enough for it, and she didn't let herself feel good about what had just happened because feeling good about it before it was proven felt like tempting something she couldn't name. She pulled into the farm and sat in the truck for a minute and looked at the remaining section of pasture on the ridge, brown again now as fall came on, and thought about Silas walking that same ridge in 1934 and writing things in a notebook that nobody read for 80 years. She went inside and made breakfast and called Dr. Voss. Cecile Harp is putting it on the menu, she said. A pause. How'd she react when she tasted it? She said it was different. It is different, Dr. Voss said. That's the whole point. Another pause. Maris, this could be something. It could also be one diner in a small town, Maris said. Sure, Dr. Voss said, and 70 sick calves could have all died. She didn't have an answer for that, so she said thank you and hung up and washed her breakfast dishes. The menu item went up in the second week of October. Cecile had written a small description, restrained, factual, the kind of description written by someone who had decided to let the food make its own argument. It said the beef was grass-finished on native prairie pasture from the Rowan family farm outside Millhaven, and it said the ranch used rotational grazing practices to restore the land. It didn't say anything about sick calves or $6 or a girl who had stood at an auction rail while the room laughed at her. Maris didn't know what was happening in the diner. She was working the fall pasture prep, repairing fencing for winter, adjusting the rotation schedule to account for the reduced herd size and let the most grazed sections rest through the cold months. She was checking on Della. She was doing what was in front of her and trying not to monitor things she couldn't control. She found out through Rosalie, who called her on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks after the menu went up. I don't want to make a bigger deal of this than it is, Rosalie said, but we've had people asking about it. Not like 1 or 2 people. Multiple tables. Where's the farm? Can they buy directly? Is there going to be more? Maris was sitting on the porch steps when she got the call. She stayed sitting on the porch steps for a while after it ended. The afternoon was cooling fast the way fall afternoons do, the light going golden and then amber and then starting to pull back from the edges of things. She thought, 58 calves, 11 died, 40 sold wholesale, 18 to Cecile, and from those 18, this. She thought about how many times in the past year she had done the arithmetic in the dark and come out the other side of it barely. And she thought about Silas's journal entry that she had read so many times she'd memorized it without trying. The extension agent said to plow it under and reseed. I didn't. I'm beginning to think he was wrong about what's up there. 3 weeks later, Gideon Mercer found out. She didn't know how. The county's information network was old and efficient, and she had never fully mapped its routes, only its destinations. What she knew was that he found out, because Phil called her on a Wednesday morning and said, Mercer's been talking. What's he saying? That it's a gimmick, Phil said. That the flavor difference is in people's heads because they read a menu description. That one good season on 60 acres doesn't mean anything. Maris looked out the kitchen window at the ridge. Is that all? No. Phil's voice shifted slightly. He's saying you won't be able to supply Cecile consistently. That you'll run out of product before spring, and she'll have to pull it from the menu, and that'll be the end of it. She was quiet for a moment. Is he wrong? About the supply problem? Phil paused. He's not entirely wrong about that. You sold 40 head wholesale this fall. You've got no breeding operation. You've got no incoming animals. You've got... I know what I've got, she said. I know you do, Phil said. I just want you to know he's not completely making things up. He's spinning it, but there's a real problem in there." "I know there's a real problem in there," she said. "I've been thinking about the real problem since August." The real problem was that she had no source of incoming animals. The 58 calves were a one-time event, purchased under circumstances she couldn't replicate with the same economics. And once they were sold and processed, she had nothing to fill the supply gap. Building a breeding operation from scratch required time and money she didn't have. Buying replacement stock at market prices required money she didn't have. The land could support more animals than she currently had on it. She was increasingly certain of that. But land capability and animal inventory were two different things, and you couldn't graze potential. She had been turning this over for weeks, and she had arrived at a partial answer that she didn't love but could live with. She would contact the same stockyard. She would ask about incoming lots of animals that needed rehabilitation. She would be more deliberate this time about what she took on and under what terms. It wasn't elegant. It was also what she knew how to do. What she had not been prepared for was the meeting that Gideon Mercer apparently had with Cecile Harp in the second week of November. Rosalie called her afterward, voice careful in the way voices get when the news is bad, and the speaker is trying to determine how bad to make it sound. "He went to see her," Rosalie said. "He offered to supply the diner directly. Said he could do 150 head a year, consistent supply, similar quality, better price, because of volume." Maris held the phone. "What did Cecile say?" "She said she'd think about it." It was the right answer for Cecile to give. Maris knew that. Cecile ran a business, not a loyalty program, and 150 head a year at a better price was a more rational offer than 18 head from a 20-year-old with a 60-acre farm and no clear path to consistent supply. There was no argument to be made that made Maris's offer objectively superior on the terms Gideon had just restructured the conversation around. She knew all of this. She still sat at the kitchen table for a long time that evening, doing nothing particularly productive. Della came in from the living room and looked at her. Della had the intuition of a person who had spent decades watching people she loved try not to show when things were hard. "What happened?" Della said. It was not a question. Maris told her. Della sat down across from her and listened, and when it was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What does Cecile want?" "What?" "Not what Gideon is offering. What does Cecile actually want when she puts that description on her menu? What is she selling her customers?" Maris looked at her. "The story," she said slowly. "The place. The specific farm." Can Gideon give her that? She thought about it. 3,000 acres, efficiently run, commercially productive. Gideon's operation was good at what it was. What it wasn't was a 60-acre hillside farm with native prairie grass documented in an 80-year-old field journal and a history that started with 70 sick calves that nobody wanted. "No," she said. "Then go tell Cecile that," Della said. "Not to be sentimental about it, because it's commercially true, and Cecile is a businesswoman, and she'll understand it." Maris drove to the diner the next morning. Cecile was doing what she'd been doing the first time. At the counter, going through invoices, pen behind her ear. She looked up, and her expression was composed in the way of a woman who had been expecting this visit and had decided in advance how she wanted to handle it. "I know why you're here," Cecile said. "I'm not here to argue against Gideon's offer," Maris said. "It's probably better on paper." Cecile studied her. "Then what are you here for?" "To ask what you're actually trying to do with the menu," Maris said. "Because I think we've been having a different conversation than the one I thought we were having, and I want to make sure I understand it before you make a decision." A pause. Cecile put her pen down. "Go ahead." "You've been trying to find a local supplier for 2 years," Maris said. "Not just local beef. Local beef with a story attached to it. Something your customers can connect to. Something that means your diner is different from the chain places on the highway." Cecile didn't confirm or deny this. She waited. "Gideon can give you consistent supply and a lower price," Maris said. "He cannot give you the Rowan farm. He cannot give you native prairie grass that's been on that ridge since before either of us was born. He cannot give you the story of what happened here this year." She stopped. "I can't give you 150 head a year. Not yet. But I can give you something he can't replicate, and I can tell you exactly what my supply chain looks like next year and the year after that, if you're willing to hear it." Cecile was quiet for longer than was comfortable. Then, "You said not yet. On the 150 head." "Yes." "What does that mean, specifically?" Maris told her. The plan she'd been building in the back of her mind, the graduated increase in herd size, the careful expansion of the rotation system, the target timeline for building a breeding component, all of it grounded in what the land could honestly support, and not an inch beyond that. It was not a polished presentation. She stumbled on the supply projection twice because she was not naturally comfortable with the formal version of persuasion, the structured argument version, and she knew it showed. Cecile watched her stumble through it without filling the gap, which Maris ultimately decided was a form of respect. She wasn't being rescued. She was being allowed to make her case on her own terms. When she finished, Cecile said, "I need you to write that down. The supply projection. Realistic numbers." "Okay. And I need you to understand that if you can't deliver, I will have to make a different arrangement. I like what you're doing. I think it's the right kind of thing, but I run a business." "I understand that," Maris said. Cecile looked at her for a moment. "Does Gideon Mercer make you angry?" she asked. The question was unexpected enough that Maris almost answered it honestly before catching herself. She thought about it. "Sometimes," she said, "but mostly he makes me want to prove something." "That's more useful," Cecile said. She left the diner with a conditional agreement, a deadline for the written supply projection, and the particular feeling of a person who has just survived a negotiation by doing something that wasn't exactly courage, but was adjacent to it. She sat in the truck and wrote down everything she'd committed to on the legal pad before she forgot it, her handwriting worse than usual from the adrenaline still working through her hands. She had 3 weeks to turn the projection into something credible. She had never written a formal supply projection. She had the journals, her own records, the soil test results, and Dr. Voss's assessment of the land's capacity. She called Dr. Voss from the parking lot. "I need help writing something," she said. "Numbers, projections. I need it to look like I know what I'm talking about." "You do know what you're talking about," Dr. Voss said. "I need it to look that way to someone else," Maris said. Dr. Voss came to the farm on a Saturday with a laptop in 3 hours, and the particular efficiency of a person who has spent 2 decades writing professional assessments of animal operations. She asked Maris questions, and Maris answered them, and Dr. Voss translated the answers into language that was specific and numerical and defensible, and by late afternoon they had something that looked like a document a person could take seriously. Maris looked at it on the screen. "Is it honest?" "Every number in it came from you," Dr. Voss said. "It's as honest as your records are." "My records are very honest," Maris said. "They include 11 calves that died." "I know." Dr. Voss looked at her. "That's actually what makes the rest of it credible. Nobody who is fabricating a success story includes the losses." She printed it at the library in Mill Haven the following Monday and drove it to Cecile before she could second-guess the phrasing again. Cecile read it at the counter with the same focused attention she gave her invoices. She took approximately 8 minutes, which Maris spent looking at the menu board and trying not to count. "Okay," Cecile said when she was done. "Okay, meaning we're going to continue our arrangement," Cecile said. "And I'm going to tell Gideon Mercer that I appreciate his offer and I've made other plans." Maris exhaled. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Cecile said. "Deliver what you said you would." She drove home on the county road with the windows cracked because the November air was cold, but she needed it, needed something on her face that was outside the truck and outside her head and outside the months of compressed anxiety that had been running underneath everything else she was doing. She turned onto the gravel road that led to the farm and came up over the small rise where the property first came into view, and she could see the ridge against the gray November sky, brown and quiet, resting the way good land rests. She did not know yet that Gideon Mercer, when Cecile Harp called him with her decision, did not respond with the gracious acceptance of a man who had simply lost a business negotiation. She did not know what he said to Cecile because Cecile did not repeat it, but she knew what he said to other people because Phil called her the following week with a new set of what Mercer was apparently telling anyone who would listen, that the supply projection was fantasy, that a 20-year-old with 60 acres and no breeding operation had no path to sustainable supply, that the whole thing would be off Cecile's menu by spring. She heard this and felt the familiar pressure of it, the weight of being told you are wrong by someone who speaks as though certainty is authority. Then she went out to the barn and checked on the 3 calves she'd brought in the week before. A small lot she'd arranged through a different contact at the stockyard, healthier than last year's lot, paying more per head because she could afford to, small enough to manage without overwhelming her current setup. She checked their temperatures. She watched them eat. She put fresh water in the trough and stood there for a moment in the cold barn listening to them move. They were not impressive calves. They were small and uncertain and new to this particular ground. She knew what that looked like, and she knew what it could become. She went back inside and opened Silas's 7th journal and found the page she'd bookmarked. The entry from 1952, when he'd apparently had a confrontation of some kind with a neighbor whose name he'd reduced to an initial in the journal, the way people do when they want to record something without being fully direct about it. M says again that what I'm doing won't hold. He has said it 4 times now in as many years. The land is still here. The cattle are still here. I have stopped responding to M because I have noticed that the people who are certain something won't work spend a great deal of energy on that certainty, and I do not have energy to spare. She closed the journal. She set it on the table. She made coffee. Outside, the 3 new calves were settling into the barn for the night, and the prairie grass on the upper ridge was holding its roots through the first hard freeze of winter, and somewhere 12 miles east, Gideon Mercer was telling someone what she could not do. She was already doing it. The 3 calves from the new lot had names by December. Maris knew she shouldn't keep doing that. Naming them made the arithmetic harder when selling time came. But the habit had settled into her during the first winter with the sick herd, and she couldn't fully break it. The smallest of the 3 was a heifer she called Pencil because she was narrow and dark and reminded Maris, in some way she couldn't articulate, of the writing in Silas's journals. The other 2 were steers. She called them nothing interesting, but she called them something. The winter was milder than the year before, which was a mercy she accepted without comment because she had learned not to count on mercy repeating itself. She managed the 3 new animals alongside the remnant of the previous herd. 7 cattle she had held back from the fall sales deliberately, the best-conditioned animals from the original 58, the ones whose weight gain and grass conversion had been most impressive across the rotation data she'd kept through the summer. She had a reason for holding them that she hadn't explained fully to anyone except Dr. Voss, and even to Dr. Voss she'd only explained the practical portion of it. The real reason was that she needed to understand what the second winter on that ground looked like for animals that had spent a full year on the native prairie rotation, whether they held their condition differently, whether the second-year cattle on Silas's grass performed in ways the first-year cattle hadn't. It was a small sample, and she knew it was a small sample, but every piece of observation she accumulated was a piece she hadn't had before, and she had learned to value the accumulation. She was in the barn on a Tuesday evening in January, going through the weight records from the fall, when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, a local area code but not one she recognized. "Is this Maris Rowan?" A man's voice. Not young. Careful. "Yes," she said. "My name is Harlan Deeds. I farm up past Sutter Creek off the East County Road." A pause. "I heard about your arrangement with Cecile Harp." She waited. "I also heard what Gideon Mercer's been saying about it," he said. "I want you to know I'm not calling because of either of those things. Exactly." "Okay," she said. "What are you calling about?" "I've got 110 acres that used to be productive," he said. "My grandfather worked it. My father worked it less. I've been working it even less than that." He stopped, as though deciding how much to say. "I drove past your property last fall. I don't know what you're doing up on that ridge, but it doesn't look like anything I've seen on degraded ground around here." She leaned against the barn wall. Outside, the wind was moving through the timber on the upper slope, and she could hear it. "It's a rotation system," she said, "based on the native grass that was already there." "The grass was already there," he repeated. "Under everything that looked like nothing," she said. "That's usually how it is." He was quiet for a moment. Could I come see it? She almost said yes immediately, and then she didn't, because she had learned in the past year to be careful about what she invited onto her property. Not from suspicion of Harlan deeds specifically. His voice had the particular weight of a man telling the truth about something he found embarrassing, which she had come to recognize as distinct from other kinds of voices. But because any visitor who came and left and talked could change the shape of her situation in ways she couldn't fully anticipate. Let me think about it, she said. Can I call you back? She could hear that the answer surprised him. Sure, he said. She called Dr. Voss that night, explained the call. Do you know anything about Harlan Deeds? She asked. I know his place, Dr. Voss said. I've been out there twice, years ago. He's not a serious farmer, but he's not a bad man. He's a man who inherited something he didn't know what to do with. A pause. Is he connected to Mercer? I didn't ask. Ask, Dr. Voss said. Not accusatorially, just find out. She called Harlan back the next morning. Before I say yes or no, she said, I want to ask you something, and I'd like a straight answer. All right, he said. Do you have a relationship with Gideon Mercer? A pause. Not a guilty pause. More like a man deciding whether to be offended and concluding it wasn't worth it. We were on the same county agricultural board about 10 years ago, he said. I don't think he'd know my name if I said it to him today. She believed him. You can come Saturday morning, she said. Harlan Deeds was 61 years old and looked like a man who had spent decades feeling vaguely apologetic about something he couldn't quite name. He arrived at 8 in the morning in a truck that was older than hers and in worse shape, which she noticed because it told her something. A man performing wealth doesn't drive that truck. He shook her hand at the gate with the formality of someone for whom the gesture still meant something, and she walked him up to the ridge. She showed him the sections, showed him the root depth on the resting sections. Pulled up the soil and let him look at it, and he crouched down the same way she had that February morning the year before. The same way people do when the ground tells them something that doesn't fit what they expected. My grandfather used to talk about the grass, Harlan said, still crouching. Said there was something in his east pasture that you couldn't kill if you tried. We paved it. He said the last 3 words with a flatness that contained a history she didn't ask about. What's left on your land? She asked. The north section, maybe 30 acres? Nobody's touched it in 20 years. He stood up, knees cracking. It looks terrible. Does it? She said. He looked at her. Then he looked at the ridge. She could see the understanding move across his face, not dramatically, just the quiet arrival of an idea he hadn't carried before. Same situation, he said. Probably, she said. I'd have to see it. She went to his property the following week on a gray Wednesday that threatened rain and didn't deliver it. She walked his north section with the same attention she'd walked her own ridge 14 months earlier, and what she found was what she'd found then. Ground that looked like nothing and wasn't. The native component was smaller than on her ridge, more interrupted, more invaded by brush in the wetter areas, but it was there. The base of it was there. She stood in the middle of his north section and tried to be honest with herself about what she was seeing and what it would take to work with it, and whether that was something she could do in addition to everything else she was already managing. The honest answer was that it was more than she could do alone. The honest answer was also that the opportunity sitting in 30 neglected acres on Harlan Deeds' farm was not one she was sure she could afford to walk away from, if they could figure out an arrangement that made sense. She drove back to his farmhouse and sat at his kitchen table, and he made coffee that was too strong, and she drank it without commenting. If we were going to work together on this, she said, it would have to be structured very carefully. I can't carry another operation on top of mine, but I could advise. I could help you set up the rotation, tell you what to look for, walk it with you through the first season. What do you want in exchange? He asked. It was a direct question, and she appreciated it. Access to your land for part of my herd's rotation, she said. If the supply arrangement with Cecile Harp grows the way I need it to, I'm going to need more grazing ground before my own acreage can carry it. Your north section, managed right, could be that ground. He looked at his coffee. How long before it's productive? 2 seasons minimum before I'd want to run cattle on it heavily, she said. But you'd see change in the first year. And if it doesn't work? Then you've lost nothing except the time we put into it, she said. The ground will be in better shape than you found it regardless. He nodded slowly. I want to think about it. Take your time, she said. She drove home on the county road thinking about scale, which was a thing she tried not to think about too directly because it had a way of making the present circumstances feel insufficient, and the present circumstances were what she had to work with. But it was there in the background of everything. If Cecile's arrangement held, if the supply projection she'd given Cecile was going to mean anything past the first year, she needed more land producing at the same quality level that her ridge was producing. She couldn't do that alone. She couldn't do it fast. She could do it carefully, piece by piece, if she was very deliberate and very patient and made good decisions about who she worked with. She was 20 years old in January. She had not had time, in the past 14 months, to fully register that fact. February came with the thing it always came with out here. The false promise of early warming followed by a cold snap that caught anyone who'd started to relax. She lost one of the second-year cattle to a freak incident involving a section of fencing that failed in the night and an animal that wandered into a drainage ditch in the dark. She found it in the morning and stood in the field in the frozen pre-dawn light and felt the loss as a specific weight on her chest, and also felt the familiar anger at herself for the fencing, which she had noted needed reinforcement 6 weeks earlier and had not gotten to. She told no one about the fence. She fixed it that day, in the cold, and she wrote it in the notebook because the notebook was where she kept the true record of things. Not just the successes, but the failures and the negligences and the days when she moved too slow. The notebook had become a second set of journals alongside Silas's. She didn't think about that parallel consciously, but it was there. March arrived, and with it a call from Rosalie at the diner, which had become the primary channel through which information about the beef arrangement moved, partly because Rosalie was naturally communicative, and partly because Cecile was not. She needs to talk to you, Rosalie said. Good talk or bad talk? Maris asked. I honestly don't know, Rosalie said, which was more alarming than either clear answer would have been. She drove to Millhaven the next morning with the particular preparedness of someone expecting bad news who has decided in advance not to react badly to it. She had done this before. She could do it again. Cecile was not at the counter this time. She was in the back, at a small table she apparently used for meetings, and she had a folder in front of her and the pen behind her ear and 2 coffees already poured. Sit down, she said. Maris sat. I've had 3 calls in the last 2 weeks, Cecile said, from restaurant owners. 2 in the next county, 1 up near the river. She opened the folder. They heard about the beef. 2 of them ate here specifically to try it. They want to know if there's supply available. Maris looked at her. I'm not telling you this to pressure you, Cecile said. I'm telling you because you need to know the shape of what's happening, and I think you need to know it from me before you hear it from someone else. How did they hear? Maris asked. People talk, Cecile said. The description on the menu, the name of the farm. People take pictures of menus now. They post them. She looked at Maris steadily. The Rowan farm is in conversations I'm not part of. The weight of this was different from what she'd expected. She had expected market pressure, supply anxiety, a conversation about whether she could deliver what she'd projected. She had not expected demand pulling ahead of her before she'd solved the supply side. What did you tell them? Maris asked. That I'd pass it along, Cecile said, and that I couldn't speak to availability. She paused. What do I tell them when they follow up? Maris thought about Harlan Deed's north section. She thought about the 3 new calves in the barn. She thought about the second-year cattle holding their weight through the winter better than the first-year animals had, the data point she'd been collecting quietly, the one that was starting to tell her something she was almost ready to say out loud. Tell them I'm building toward it, she said. Tell them it won't be this year. Tell them if they want to be in the conversation, I'll call them when I'm ready. Cecile looked at her for a moment. That's either very smart or very costly. I know, Maris said. You're not going to try to supply them now, even though you don't have the capacity. No, because I've watched what happens when you promise more than you can deliver, Maris said. And I'm not going to do that. Cecile was quiet for a moment. Then she closed the folder. All right, she said. I'll tell them. She was almost at the diner door when Cecile said, Maris. She turned. Gideon Mercer came in for lunch last week, Cecile said, with 2 other men. He ordered the beef. She hadn't expected that. What did he say about it? Cecile's expression was neutral in a way that contained something. He didn't say anything about it. He ate it. He didn't leave any. Maris held the door handle. Okay, she said. I thought you should know, Cecile said. She drove home with that sitting in her mind. Gideon Mercer, at Cecile's table, eating beef from the farm he'd been calling a fantasy for 14 months. She tried to derive meaning from it and found she couldn't, not with certainty. People eat things without endorsing them. People try things out of curiosity or competitive intelligence or the simple fact that they were hungry and it was on the menu. She didn't know what it meant that he hadn't left any. She decided it meant nothing specific and then spent the rest of the drive thinking about it anyway. April came and the ground warmed correctly this time, without the false start of February, and she began the second year's rotation on the ridge with the kind of practiced attention that looks like calm from the outside and is actually just fear converted into procedure. She had a routine now. She had a way of reading the grass that she hadn't had a year ago. Not perfect knowledge, not the certainty she'd heard in Silas's late journals, but something being built in the same direction. She walked sections before moving the herd. She crouched and looked at root base and soil moisture and recovery rate, and she made notes and cross-referenced them against last year's records for the same sections at the same time of year. The recovery rate was faster, meaningfully faster. The soil was doing something that soil does when it's been given the right conditions for 2 consecutive years rather than 1. A cumulative effect, a momentum that the first year of good management sets in motion and the second year builds on. She knew this was documented in the literature. She had read it in the book Dr. Voss had lent her. Knowing it theoretically and watching it happen in ground, she had walked every week for over a year were 2 different kinds of knowing, and the second kind went somewhere the first kind didn't reach. She called Dr. Voss on a warm evening in early May from the ridge, sitting on the slope with the cattle grazing the 3rd section below her. I need you to come out here, she said. I need a second set of eyes on what I'm seeing. Dr. Voss came the following Saturday. She walked the sections with Maris for 2 hours, pulling samples, looking at root depth, examining the composition of what was coming up in the sections that had been through 2 full rotations. She was quiet most of the time, the way she was quiet when she was processing rather than when she had nothing to say. At the end of it, standing at the top of the ridge, with the late afternoon coming in warm, and the cattle visible below on the 4th section, Dr. Voss said, You need to document this. I am documenting it, Maris said. The notebooks. Formally, Dr. Voss said. Photographs. Dated. Soil tests. Sequential, so you have before and after. Weight gain records per animal, correlated with which sections they grazed. You need a chain of evidence. She looked at Maris. Because when people start asking how you did this, and they're going to start asking, you need to be able to show them. Maris looked at the ridge. I don't want to turn this into a performance. It's not a performance, Dr. Voss said. It's documentation. There's a difference. She paused. Silas documented it in his journals. That's why you were able to do what you did. If he hadn't, you'd have been starting from nothing. She hadn't thought about it that way. She thought about it now. Okay, she said. She started the formal documentation in May, systematic soil sampling from marked locations so the same spots could be retested in sequence, weekly photographs of each section with date stamps, detailed weight records organized by which section each animal had grazed in the preceding 2 weeks. It was more record-keeping than she'd been doing, and there were days it felt like too much on top of everything else. And she did it anyway because Dr. Voss was right, and she knew Dr. Voss was right. Harlan Deeds called in June with his decision. I want to try it, he said. On the north section. Whatever you think makes sense to start. I'll come out next week, she said. We'll walk it again, and I'll show you how to read what you're looking for. I want to be clear about something, Harlan said, with the care of a man who had composed what he wanted to say before dialing. I'm not looking for you to do this for me. I want to learn it. Something in her responded to that more strongly than she expected. Good, she said. That's the only way it works long term. She spent a Saturday morning at his property walking the north section with him, the way Dr. Voss had once walked her ridge with her, not prescribing, but pointing. Here's what you're looking at. Here's why it matters. Here's the mistake you'll be tempted to make, and here's what happens when you make it. She showed him how to read root depth without a tool, just by pulling a handful and looking at what came with it. She showed him the difference between a section recovering correctly and one being grazed down too far. He was a better student than she expected. He asked questions that were specific rather than general, which told her he was actually looking at the ground rather than listening politely. My grandfather would have known all of this, he said at one point, crouching over a sample the way she'd shown him. Probably, she said. We stopped knowing it, he said, somewhere between his generation and mine. She didn't say anything to that. It was true, and it was complicated, and the field didn't need her to comment on it. The summer moved fast in the way that summers do when you're inside the work rather than observing it. The rotation on her ridge ran through its second full cycle. The cattle, the second-year animals and the new 3 from winter, were performing in the way she'd been watching them build toward, the weight gain steady and the condition good, and the particular quality of the meat, when Dr. Voss assessed it at the fall health check, described in language that was medically specific and amounted to, "This is what you hoped it would be." The diner was full on the nights Cecile ran the beef as a special. Rosalie reported this with the regularity of a correspondent filing from the field, and Maris received the information and stored it and tried not to let it inflate what she thought she knew. She was in the barn on a September evening when she heard a truck on the gravel. Not Phil's truck, not Dr. Voss's. She knew those sounds. This was unfamiliar. She came out of the barn and into the low September light and saw the truck. A good truck, clean, the kind of truck a man drives when he wants people to know he's successful, parked at the gate. And she saw Gideon Mercer standing beside it, not leaning on it with his arms crossed, the way he'd stood at the stockyard, not calling across a distance with the comfortable authority of a man on the right side of things, standing at the gate with his hat in his hand, which she noted because it was the first time she had ever seen him without it on his head. She walked toward the gate. She didn't hurry. "Maris," he said. She stopped on her side of the gate and looked at him. He looked older than he had at the auction. Or maybe she was just seeing him differently now that she was looking at him straight rather than sideways. "Gideon?" she said. He looked at the ridge for a moment. "I've been driving past here for 2 years," he said, "watching what you're doing up there." He turned back to her. "I ate Cecile's beef in March. I told myself it was curiosity." She waited. "I went back 4 more times," he said. She kept waiting. She had learned, in the past 2 years, that waiting was something men like Gideon Mercer found very uncomfortable, and that discomfort sometimes produced honesty that comfort would not. "I've got 300 acres on the east side of my property that are underperforming," he said, "not because the land is bad, because I've been running it the wrong way for 15 years, and I knew it, and didn't change." He stopped. His jaw moved in the way of a person choosing between 2 versions of what they want to say. "I want to know how you'd approach it." She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of what was happening and what it meant, and she was also aware of every specific thing he had said over the past 2 years. The auction, the window coming down on the county road, the offers to Cecile, the commentary through Phil, the patient, certain dismissal of everything she was doing. She was also aware that the most satisfying response she could make was not necessarily the correct one. "Come in," she said, and unlatched the gate. She walked him up to the ridge. She showed him what she'd shown Harlan in June: root depth, recovery rate, the sequential soil test records she'd been building since May. She showed him the weight records and explained what they indicated. She didn't editorialize. She didn't say "I told you so" in any of the 17 ways a person can say it without using those words. She showed him the facts. Gideon walked the ridge with the focused attention of a man who had spent 40 years looking at land professionally and was recalibrating what he was seeing against what he thought he knew. He didn't say much. When he did speak, it was in the language of practical assessment: carrying capacity, recovery interval, the soil composition questions that told her he was thinking about it seriously. At the top of the ridge, looking east toward where his property began beyond the tree line, he said, "I told a lot of people you weren't going to make it." "I know," she said. I was wrong, he said. It came out plainly, without preamble or softening. The way certain men of a particular generation say hard things, directly, once, without looking for a response. She didn't give him a response exactly. She said, "Your 300 acres, what's the current forage situation?" He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, that she had moved past the moment rather than held it. Fescue, mostly. Overgrazed. Some sections I've been resting for 2 years, but I haven't been managing the rest period properly. I'd need to walk it, she said, before I could tell you anything useful. I know, he said. Would you? She looked at the ridge. She thought about Silas writing, "I have stopped responding to M, because I have noticed that the people who are certain something won't work spend a great deal of energy on that certainty, and I do not have energy to spare." She thought about what Silas would have done if M had shown up at his gate with his hat in his hand. "Yes," she said. "I'll walk it." They came back down from the ridge in the cooling September evening, and the cattle moved on the lower section, and Gideon's truck sat at the gate where he'd left it, and neither of them said anything particularly significant the rest of the way down. But something had shifted in the geography of the county that afternoon. Something that had no name yet, no defined shape, but was real in the way that things are real before they've been given language. She latched the gate behind him and watched his truck go down the gravel road and turn onto the county road heading east, and she stood there for a moment in the quiet. Then she went back to the barn and checked on Pencil, who had grown from a narrow dark heifer into something considerably more substantial and was eating with the focused authority of an animal in excellent condition on good ground. She wrote the evening's weight in the notebook. She made a note about Gideon's visit without editorializing. She noted the weather and the section rotation status and what she needed to check in the morning. She closed the notebook and sat for a moment in the barn quiet, with the smell of good hay and healthy animals, and the ridge outside holding what it had always held, patient and indifferent and sufficient. She walked Gideon's east section on a Thursday in early October, 2 days after the first hard frost had come through, and left the grass silver in the morning. He met her at the gate of his property and drove her out to the 300 acres in his clean truck, and she noticed he didn't talk much on the way, which was different from the Gideon she'd encountered at the auction and at the stockyard window and in all the second-hand versions of him that had reached her through Phil and Rosalie over 2 years. That Gideon had always been talking. This one was watching her. The east section was what he described, fescue-dominated, overgrazed in the areas closest to the water source, the classic pattern of cattle taking the path of least resistance and concentrating pressure where the walking was easiest. The 2 sections he'd been resting showed some recovery, but not the kind she saw on her ridge, because resting ground without managing it is only half the equation. The grass that was coming back in the wrong composition, annuals filling the gaps where perennials should be, a sign that the soil had been pushed past a threshold and was healing itself with whatever was available rather than what was ideal. She walked it for 90 minutes. He walked beside her and didn't ask questions until she stopped, which told her he understood that she was reading something and didn't want to interrupt the reading. When she finally stopped at the far end of the north-facing slope, she crouched and pulled a handful the way she'd taught Harlan, and she looked at it for a moment. "You've got something to work with here," she said. "Less than I had on my ridge, but it's there. The north slope especially. This section hasn't been grazed as hard, and the base composition is better." He crouched beside her. Not performatively, he was actually looking at what she was showing him. "How long? Before you'd see meaningful change? 1 full season of managed rotation, done correctly." She stood up. "Before the soil profile shifts enough to affect the product quality the way mine has? Minimum 2 years. Probably 3 on the hardest used sections." He stood too. He was looking at the ground, not at her. "I've been ranching this property for 22 years, he said. "My father had it before me. We never looked at it the way you're looking at it right now." She didn't say anything. "I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me about that," he said, with a sharpness that she recognized. It was the sharpness of a proud man preempting sympathy he doesn't want. "I'm just saying it because it's true." "I know," she said. "My great-grandfather figured it out, and then nobody paid attention to it for 60 years. That's how this usually goes." He looked at her sideways. "You're not going to make this easy on me." "I'm not trying to make it hard," she said. I'm trying to tell you what I actually see, which is what you came to me for." He was quiet for a moment. "What would you need from me to get started?" She had thought about this on the drive over. She had thought about it carefully, the way she thought about the supply projections and the rotation schedules and everything else in her operation that required her to be precise rather than approximate. She was not going to offer her expertise for free, not out of hostility, but because she had learned that free expertise is expertise that people don't take seriously. She had also decided that what she wanted from this arrangement was not money, primarily. "Access to your north slope for my herd's rotation," she said. "Same arrangement as Harlan Deed's north section. I manage a portion of your land as an extension of my rotation system. In exchange, I consult on your 300 acres, walk it with you, show you what I see, answer questions. You do the actual work on your end." He processed this. "You want my land for your cattle." "I want the native components on your land to contribute to what I'm building," she said. "Your north slope, managed correctly, would be productive for both of us. Your cattle improve in condition. Mine have more high-quality grazing ground. The land recovers." She looked at him. "And you learn what you're looking at well enough to not need me eventually." He turned that over. She could see him doing it, running the economics, the logic, the pride calculation that was always somewhere in these conversations with men who had been the authority in a room for decades. "That last part," he said, "that's an interesting thing to offer." "It's the only thing worth offering," she said. "I can't be on your property every week, and I wouldn't want to be." He looked at the ridgeline that separated his east section from the county road. "All right," he said. "Draw it up the same way you did with Cecile. Numbers, timeline, what you expect, and what you need." "I will," she said. She drove home that afternoon through the October light that comes in sideways and makes everything look older than it is. And she thought about what she had just agreed to and whether it was the right thing or just the expedient thing, and she couldn't entirely tell the difference, which she had come to recognize as the condition of most significant decisions. What she did know was that Gideon Mercer's 300 East acres, if they performed the way her ridge had performed after 2 years of managed rotation, would give her enough high-quality grazing ground to supply Cecile consistently and still be in a position to talk to the 3 restaurant owners who had called in the spring. Not immediately. Not without more animals, more infrastructure, more of the careful sequencing that the whole operation ran on. But the path was becoming visible in a way it hadn't been when she was 23 months ago with 70 sick calves and $6.30 and a farm nobody had worked properly in over a decade. She told Della that evening, not the full business logic of it. Della didn't need the business logic, but the fact of it. That Gideon Mercer had come to her. That she'd agreed to work with him. Della was in the kitchen when she said it, making the soup she made every Thursday because Thursday was soup, and she stopped stirring and looked at Maris over the pot. "How did that feel?" Della asked. "Strange," Maris said honestly. "Strange good or strange bad?" She thought about it. "Strange like when something you've been carrying for a long time gets set down," she said. "And you're not sure yet if you're relieved or if you just missed the weight." Della considered this, went back to the soup. "That sounds right," she said. The winter that followed was the 3rd winter on the Rowan property, and it was different from the first 2 in ways that were hard to quantify but easy to feel. The first winter had been crisis and survival. The second had been consolidation and the beginning of proof. This one was something else, steadier, with less of the edge-of-the-cliff quality that had characterized every decision she'd made before she had data behind her. She still worked the same hours. The cold was still cold. She still broke ice from water troughs before dawn and checked temperatures and kept the notebooks and worried about the things that were going to happen that she hadn't anticipated yet. But there was something underneath it now that there hadn't been before. Not confidence exactly. She was too cautious for full confidence, too aware of how many things could still go wrong. Call it orientation. A sense of which direction she was pointed and why. Harlan Deeds was learning. This was the fact she hadn't been certain of in June and was increasingly certain of now. He called her twice a month with questions that were getting more specific as the months passed. He'd moved from asking what to do to asking why it worked, which was the shift she'd been watching for. She drove out to his north section in November, and walked it with him, and the recovery on the sections he'd managed through the fall rotation was genuinely encouraging. Not spectacular. She had to keep reminding herself not to compare his first year to her second, because the comparison wasn't fair to either of them, but real. The root depth on the rested sections was measurably improved. The composition was shifting toward the perennial base. "You see this?" she said, crouching over a sample in his second section. "This grass wasn't here in June." Harlan crouched beside her. He looked at it with the attention of a man who had been trained to see it now. "It's the same as your ridge." "Same family," she said. "Not identical. Your soil has a different history, but the same principle." She stood up. "You didn't plant that. It was here all along." He was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather planted it, probably," he said, "or protected it, or whatever the right word is. Or just didn't plow it under when someone told him to," she said. He smiled at that. It was a tired smile, the kind that contains more history than the expression itself can carry. "He was stubborn," he said. "I used to think that was a flaw." She didn't say anything to that, because she was thinking about Silas. She was always, at some level, thinking about Silas. January brought a disease event that reminded her, brutally and without warning, that nothing in this work was ever fully settled. A respiratory illness moved through the county, not the same pathogen as the original herd, something different, moving differently. And it hit 3 operations within 15 miles of her farm in the first 2 weeks of the month. She heard about it through Phil first, and then through the county extension alert that went out on a Tuesday morning, and she was in the barn within an hour of reading it, checking every animal she had with the systematic attention of a person who knows what early signs look like, and knows that early is the only time intervention matters. Her herd was clean. She checked every day for 2 weeks. She adjusted the ventilation in the barn and reduced any situations that could stress the animals, because stress suppresses immunity, and she knew that as well as she knew her own name. She was on the phone with Dr. Voss every other day during those 2 weeks, reporting temperatures and appetite and behavior. And Dr. Voss told her on the 4th call that she was probably doing more checking than was strictly necessary, and Maris said she knew that and kept checking. The fever, when it came hard to 3 farms in the eastern part of the county. One of them lost a significant portion of their herd. Another lost all of theirs. The third was a smaller operation that had been already struggling, and the disease ended it completely. She heard about each loss through Phil over a period of 10 days, and each one sat in her in a specific way. Not triumphantly, not with any version of "I told you so," but with the particular gravity of someone who knows what it costs to lose animals you've been responsible for. Her herd didn't get sick. She was not entirely sure why. Dr. Voss, when she walked the barn in February, offered a theory. The nutritional condition of the cattle on the native grass rotation, the lower stress profile of animals managed without the pressure of intensive production, possibly the soil microbiome contributing something to the grass that the animals were ingesting, and that was affecting their immune response in ways that weren't fully understood yet. It was a theory. It was not proof. But it was consistent with what Maris's notebook showed. And it was consistent with what Silas had written about his cattle in the 40s doing better on the ridge than off it during a bad winter, which he'd noted without explanation. Gideon Mercer called her in February, not about the east section, which they were scheduled to begin the rotation protocol on in April, about the disease event. "I lost 40 head, he said. She hadn't known that. Phil hadn't told her. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it straightforwardly, without the complication of their history, because losing 40 animals was a straightforward loss and deserved a straightforward response. "My east section animals didn't get it," he said. "The ones on the sections we've already started managing differently." She was quiet for a moment. "How many on those sections?" 22, he said. "All clean. The animals I kept on the conventional pasture, those are the ones I lost." She sat with this. The sample was small. The variables were imperfectly controlled. She was not going to make a claim she couldn't support. "That's meaningful," she said carefully. "It's not conclusive." "I know it's not conclusive," he said. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, not broken, but humbled in a way that went deeper than the hat-in-hand moment at her gate. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying I saw it, and I wanted you to know I saw it. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She thought about the county extension agent who had told Silas to plow the ridge under. She thought about the auction room laughing. She thought about the check Gideon had slapped on her fence post and the smile he'd worn when he put it there. And she thought about him on the phone just now, 60 years old, telling a 21-year-old woman that he had seen something and wanted her to know. People can change. Not easily. Not without cost. But they can. Spring arrived, and with it a conversation she hadn't anticipated. Doctor. Voss called on a Wednesday afternoon, and the call started normally. A scheduling question, a health check date, and then shifted into something different. I got a call from a woman at the State Land Grant University, Dr. Voss said. She's in the agricultural science department. She's been following some data I submitted on the soil tests from your property. Maris put down the mug she'd been holding. You submitted my soil tests? With your name attached and a note that you'd need to authorize any further inquiry, Dr. Voss said. I should have told you I was considering it. I'm telling you now. She was quiet. She tried to locate her reaction, anger, flattery, unease, something, and found a complicated mixture she didn't have words for. What does she want? To visit, Dr. Voss said, to see what you're doing, potentially to include your operation in a study she's developing on native prairie restoration in marginal agricultural land. A study, Maris said. Yes. What does that mean for me practically? Probably some additional soil sampling that they'd pay for, Dr. Voss said. A visit or two. Your records, the notebooks, the rotation data, all of it, would form part of the observational basis. She'd want to see Silas's journals, too, if you're willing. She thought about Silas. She thought about him writing alone in a notebook for 60 years with no one to submit his observations to, no institution paying attention, nothing validating what he knew except the ground itself. What's her name? Maris asked. Dr. Patricia Shen, Dr. Voss said. She's good. I checked. Let me think about it, Maris said. She thought about it for 4 days. She talked to Della about it, which was how she made most decisions that felt larger than daily management. Not because Della would tell her what to do, but because saying things out loud to a person who was listening was different from circling the same thoughts alone. She's worried they'll take it away from her, Della said to no one in particular on the second evening of the conversation, while she was hemming something in the armchair by the window. I'm right here, Maris said. I know, Della said. Are you? She was worried about that. She was worried that inviting formal attention to what she was doing would change it, flatten it into something institutional, strip out the parts that couldn't be measured, turn Silas's journals into data points in a study, and her notebooks into an appendix. She was worried that the thing she'd built in the particular silence of being ignored was something that only worked in that silence. She called Dr. Shen herself, rather than going back through Dr. Voss. The woman answered on the second ring with a directness that Maris immediately found easier to work with than the elaborate professional preambles she'd expected. Tell me what you actually want, Maris said, after they'd exchanged approximately 40 seconds of identification. Not the study description. What you want. A brief pause that sounded like surprise and then recalibration. I want to document what's happening on your land before it gets misunderstood, Dr. Shen said. There's a version of this story that becomes a trend piece in an agricultural magazine and loses everything specific about it. I'd like there to be a version with your name on it and your grandfather's name on it that says exactly what was done and why it worked. Maris sat with that. Great-grandfather, she said. I'm sorry? Silas was my great-grandfather, she said. Not my grandfather. Great-grandfather, Dr. Shen said. I'll get it right. She agreed to the study. The first visit happened in May. Dr. Shen and a graduate student named Marcus, who was 24 and quietly awed by the journals in a way that he tried and failed to make look professional. Maris walked them up the ridge the same way she'd walked Harlan and Gideon, and she showed them the same things she always showed people. And the difference was that Dr. Shen had the vocabulary to talk about what she was seeing in a way that Maris hadn't heard before. Not more correctly than Maris understood it, but in a different register, the scientific register that overlaid the practical one. It was strange and not unpleasant, like hearing a song she knew played in a different key. Marcus asked if he could photograph the journals. She said yes. He handled them with a care that she appreciated more than she expressed. "These are remarkable," he said, about the fourth one, the 1944 journal where Silas had written 4 pages on a single observation about how the cattle on the ridge section behaved differently in high heat than those in the creek bottom. "He was alone with them for 60 years, she said. "Nobody was checking." Marcus looked at her. "Does that make you angry?" She thought about it honestly. "It used to," she said. "Now it mostly just makes me want to make sure what I'm writing down is accurate. Summer passed the way the third summer on a farm passes, when you know what you're doing well enough to do it without the constant terror of doing it wrong, which is not to say easily, not to say without problems, but with a different quality of problem. The problems were specific rather than existential. The fence on the lower section needed replacement, not reinforcement. 2 animals needed veterinary attention for unrelated issues. The rotation on Gideon's east section, in its first full year of management, was performing at about 60% of what she'd projected, which was within the range she'd told him to expect and which he'd accepted without complaint because she'd told him in advance not to expect more. She delivered the second year's supply to Cecile in October, and this time it was not 18 head. It was 31, her own herd, now properly built out to a scale the land could support, plus 7 animals that had grazed Harlan's north section through the summer under the access arrangement. Cecile looked at the numbers when Maris brought them. "You said you'd be at 25 to 30 by year 3. "The north section performed better than I projected," Maris said. "I wanted to be conservative with you." Cecile looked at her. "The 3 restaurant owners," she said. "2 of them are still interested." "I know," Maris said. "I'm not ready for them yet." "When will you be?" "Year 4, she said. "Maybe late year 4, one of them, not both." Cecile nodded once. "I'll tell them to stay patient." She drove home from the diner in the October dark, and she was tired in the particular way of someone who has been building something for 3 years with their hands and their mind, and the specific resource of not giving up even when giving up would have been reasonable. She was 22 years old. She had a farm with a functioning operation on it. She had a supply arrangement with Cecile Harp and a consultation arrangement with Harlan Deeds, and a working relationship with Gideon Mercer that was nothing like the thing it had started as. She had a study being written about her land by a university scientist who had asked, on her 3rd visit, if she'd be willing to speak at an agricultural conference in the spring. She had not said yes to the conference yet. She was working up to it. What happened in November was not dramatic the way the big moments of the past 3 years had been dramatic. It didn't arrive with a phone call or a confrontation or a decision that felt like standing at the edge of something. It arrived quietly, the way the most significant things tend to arrive when you've stopped bracing for them. Della had been well. Better than well, by the standards of a woman in her late 70s who had been told 2 years ago that her heart required careful management. She had her monthly appointments. She took her medication with the precision of someone who had made a private agreement with her body and intended to honor it. She walked every morning down the gravel road and back, at a pace her doctor approved, and she made soup on Thursdays and hemmed things in the armchair and read the journals Maris had started transcribing into a clean notebook, a project she'd begun because the original pencil was fading and she wanted the record preserved. She passed in her sleep on a Tuesday night in the 3rd week of November. Maris found her in the morning, and the finding was the worst thing she had experienced, and she would not describe it to anyone, not even Dr. Voss, in more detail than that. Some things belong to the person who experienced them. The grief was not orderly. Grief never is, regardless of what people say about stages and processes and the tidy architecture of loss. It arrived, and it did what it did, and Maris let it do what it did because she had enough respect for Della to not try to manage it into something more convenient. The farm kept requiring what it required. She kept showing up. She did not do this heroically. She did it because the cattle didn't care about her grief, and the fencing didn't care, and the rotation schedule didn't care. And there is something in the indifference of real work that is, if not comforting, at least honest about the terms of things. She put Della's name in the notebook, not as a notation, as a dedication, at the front of the new transcription volume, for Della Rowan, who told me to read the journals, and for Silas Rowan, who wrote them. Phil came to the memorial service, which was small because Della had outlived most of the people who would have come. Dr. Voss came. Harlan Deeds came, which surprised her. Cecile Harp sent flowers, which was not a thing Maris had expected from her, and which made her cry in a moment she had been holding together until that particular kindness undid it. Gideon Mercer came. He stood in the back. He did not speak to her until everyone else had left, and then he said, "She was here before most of us." And Maris said, "Yes," and that was the conversation. It was sufficient. She went back to work the following week because going back to work was the right thing, and also because Della had said don't stop, and Maris took the instructions seriously in the specific way she took all of Della's instructions, as things that had been considered carefully before being offered and deserved to be received in kind. December came. The notebooks filled. The journals, now transcribed into a second clean copy, sat in the kitchen with the originals beside them, the two versions of the same knowledge, one fading and one fresh. Dr. Shen called in January to ask again about the conference. "Yes," Maris said, "I'll do it." The conference was in April at the university in the capital, and she drove there in the truck she'd finally replaced the alternator on, 8 months after she'd been meaning to, because the old part had finally given out completely, and left her on the side of the county road in February for 45 minutes, waiting for Phil to come with jumper cables. She wore clean clothes, and the speech she'd written twice, and then thrown out, and then written again, plainer than the first two versions, because the first two versions were trying to sound like a speech, and she didn't want to sound like a speech. She wanted to sound like someone telling the truth about something. There were maybe 90 people in the room, ranchers, academics, extension agents, a few people she didn't recognize who might have been journalists. She stood at the front of the room and looked at all of them looking at her, and she thought about the auction room, which had also been full of people looking at her, and found the comparison darkly funny in a way she didn't share with the audience. She talked about Silas first. She talked about the journals, what they contained, what he'd understood that the consensus of his time hadn't, what it cost to trust your own observation against the weight of institutional authority. She talked about the ridge and the rotation and the numbers, which Dr. Shen had organized into slides that Maris pointed at, without fully trusting they told the story by themselves. She talked about the 11 calves. She said that number out loud in a room of 90 people, and she did not minimize it or contextualize it away. She said 11 animals died, and that was the true count. And any account of what she'd built that didn't include that number was an incomplete account. She said this because she had seen too many agricultural success stories that buried their losses, and she thought the buried losses were why people kept making the same mistakes, and she thought that was worth saying out loud. She talked about Della at the end, just briefly. She said there was a woman who told her not to stop, and she hadn't stopped, and the rest of what she was standing up here describing was the consequence of that instruction being followed. She didn't talk about Gideon Mercer by name. She talked about what it felt like to be publicly dismissed by someone with authority, and what it did to you, and what you did with what it did to you. She said the dismissal had been useful in the way that resistance is useful to someone who is building strength, that she had pushed against it, and the pushing had made her more certain of what she was doing, not because certainty is always correct, but because certainty earned through sustained contradiction is a different thing than certainty that's never been tested. She said, the land remembered what people had forgotten about it. She said, the grass was there before anyone plowed it under, and it was still there after, and all she had done was ask a different question about what she was looking at. She said, her great-grandfather had known all of this. He had written it down alone for 60 years. She said she thought about what it meant that nobody had been listening, and she thought what it meant was that we need to be more careful about who we decide isn't worth listening to. She drove home after the conference in the late afternoon light, on the same roads she had driven for 3 years, past the stockyard where it had started, past the feed store in Clarkfield, up the county road to the gravel road to the gate. She parked and got out and stood for a moment at the gate the way she sometimes did, not performing the moment but genuinely needing a second before the work started again. The ridge was green in April, in a way it hadn't been when she arrived, more uniformly green, more confidently green, the green of ground that has been learning for 3 years what it is supposed to be doing and is doing it better. The cattle were on the third section, visible from the gate, moving slowly the way healthy animals on good grass move. Pencil was there. She could pick her out from the gate because Pencil was still narrower than the others despite having grown into a solid, well-conditioned animal, and she moved with a deliberateness that Maris had always found particular to her. She was 4 years old now. If you counted from the winter, she'd arrived thin and uncertain and new to this ground. Maris latched the gate behind her and walked up toward the barn. Inside, on the shelf she'd built last summer specifically to hold them, were Silas's journals and the transcription volumes and her own 11 notebooks. 3 years of daily record, imperfect and complete. She put her conference folder next to them. She did not think about what it all meant in any large or summarizing way, because she had found that the large and summarizing thoughts were the ones that got in the way of the next actual thing that needed doing. She changed her clothes. She went out to check the rotation. She wrote the afternoon in the notebook: section condition, animal count, water, weather. Then she went inside and made soup because it was Thursday, and Thursday was soup, and some things you carry forward not because someone told you to, but because they are worth carrying and you know the difference. The ridge held what it had always held. The grass held its roots through whatever came next. And the notebooks kept filling, one careful day at a time, with the true record of what this particular ground was capable of when someone finally stopped telling it what it couldn't do and asked, instead,